These are some of the plants I have bought in the past that I've since vowed to never purchase again because honestly they're a massive pain in the bum. I've often brought plants home, stressed about their care for months and months, not knowing why they're behaving the way they do, when I should have just said enough is enough and turfed them out onto the street. Well, not anymore. I've made a promise to myself that if a plant is just not happy in my home, then it's not welcome to stay. I'm not going to provide a roof over its head, as well as food and water and warmth, only for it to chuck it in my face like an ungrateful 3-year-old child. So, take note of these plants and add them to your collection with great caution. Let's start with a plant that has already failed on me once in the past, and to my horror, it's now failing on me again. The Syngonium Red Arrow. I love the idea of this plant. Just look how stunning it is when in rude health. Its lush, long locks cascading from the pot like a beautiful goddess's hair, enchanting you to part with your hard-earned money to buy one. Don't do it, it's a trap. The problem is, this plant has been a nightmare for me to look after, and part of me wishes I never bought one. I just don't know how to keep it happy. I know about as much about what women want than I do about what this plant wants. Last year, I kept it in a macrame hanger in front of my east-facing window in the dining room, and it just went on a downward spiral with the leaves fading until they eventually fell off. I was left with a hanging plant graveyard. Luckily, or unluckily as it turns out, I was able to salvage some of the stems to make some rooted cuttings and create a new plant. I figured the reason my old plant died was because of too much sun, so I kept this new plant on my fireplace mantle well away from the window, and yet I'm starting to see the fading on the leaves I saw on my old plant. I water it when it's dry, but not so dry that it becomes crispy. I feed it correctly, and it's in a pretty decent spot light-wise, but it still wants to act up. If you've got the secret sauce for keeping this plant happy, then please let me know in the comments. If you don't own one yet, and are thinking of getting one, you might want to think about getting an alternative, easier to care for plant. And I recommend the Pothos Devil's Ivy or the Marble Queen. This next one will probably get me into hot water with a lot of you, because it's a very popular plant, but I just find it gives me so much grief and very little benefit. And I also think there's a better looking and easier to care for alternative that is probably more affordable too. The Chinese money plant, or the Pilea peperomoides to give it its proper name, has proven to be a bit of a nightmare plant for me, and I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. Firstly, there's one thing this plant loves to do above everything else, and that is to lose its lower leaves. So you end up with a thin, tall stalk with no foliage near the base. There's pretty much nothing you can do about this too. It's a function of how it grows. It focuses its energy at the top, where it's pushing out new leaves, and the bottom ones become weaker until it loses its leaves. I get lots of comments and questions in the comments section and on Instagram about this, but I always say it's just a fact of life, no matter how lovingly you care for it. The other problem is that it's highly sensitive to overwatering. It hates having wet soil for long. Just look at the leaves on my plant. There are holes in the middle of pretty much all of them. So not only do I only have leaves at the top, but the ones I do have holes in them. And why is this? So I didn't let the soil dry out before watering it again. Its roots took on too much water, the leaves blistered and burst, leaving those unsightly holes. At first I thought my plant was getting attacked by bugs, but after doing a little bit of googling I found that it's an overwatering problem. And I only watered it because I was treating the soil for fungus gnat larvae with tannin drops, and I wish I hadn't bothered. Instead of messing around with the Chinese money plant, get yourself a Peperomia raindrop. It's very similar with big, beautiful, glossy, round leaves that actually stay on the plant. It's very unfussy and usually very cheap. But for some reason, the Chinese money plant is much more popular, even though the raindrop is a much better bet. Not all peperomias are equal. One peperomia that you should definitely avoid is the watermelon peperomia. I love this species of plant. I find them generally trouble-free and beautiful looking, but this guy is the exception to the rule. I had 2 of these in my burgeoning collection 2 years ago, and both of them suffered until I had to chuck them out. The new leaves kept emerging deformed and misshapen, and I found the foliage to be so delicate that they were highly sensitive to under or overwatering. This plant is the true Goldilocks of the peperomia world. It doesn't like its soil to be too wet or too dry, but rather just right. Anything less than perfect and the leaves will look a mess. I found that most of my peperomias like a few hours of direct sun. Big mistake for this guy. The foliage really doesn't appreciate it. If you like the look of this plant, with the oval leaves and delicate petioles, then consider a Santorini or an Angulata instead. These are two of the most forgiving plants out there and are ideal for beginners. This next plant holds the record for the shortest amount of time between me buying it from the store and then killing it. And I don't think I'm alone here, because I've seen lots of folks suffer with this plant. Can you guess what it is? It's the string of pearls. The challenge with this plant, as with most other string of somethings, is keeping it nice and full on top, with lots of full stems hanging down all sides of the pot. And this is something I massively failed at. I feel I was a little bit conned when I purchased it from B&Q. It was displayed wrapped in cellophane with all the beads piled into the pot. I thought, great, this is a full looking plant, I'll buy it. I took it home, unravelled the cellophane and discovered that there weren't as many stems in the plant as I was led to believe. There were still enough for me to play with though, but the mistake I made was keeping it perched high on my bathroom cabinet. You see, I was hoping I could grow a nice full plant with lots of gorgeous stems trailing down over my bathroom cabinet. Who wouldn't love that? Unfortunately, this meant that the crown never saw much natural light because of the ceiling being in the way of its view of the sky, so the stems got weaker and weaker until they dropped off one by one. And this wasn't a gradual process either. They all pretty much fell off within only a couple of weeks. One minute they were there, the next they were gone. This plant certainly isn't very forgiving. Make a couple of mistakes like not giving it the light it needs, or giving it too much water, and it's hard to recover from. The worst thing to see is a stem with beads near the top and bottom of the stem, but nothing in between. And this happens because they're so sensitive to touch and fall off whenever we touch them. And what can you do here? You're forced to cut the entire stem off, making the whole problem worse. Needless to say, I won't be buying this or any other string of somethings again. It's not worth the hassle. Let's talk about Kalanchoe's next. A super popular, beautiful looking plant that has little flowers of all sorts of different colours that I'm actually a really big fan of. The problem is though that this plant is sold in the houseplant section, so you'd expect to be able to take it home and get it to reflower year after year. Not so, my plant friends. This plant is very similar to the poinsettia in that it requires ridiculously specific care requirements in the autumn to trick it into blooming a fresh set of flowers in winter. I've tried this twice and both times I failed, so I've basically given up. They require 16 hours of total darkness every day during autumn and early winter, and then bright light for the remaining 8 hours of the day. And it cannot receive even the slightest glimmer of natural artificial light during those 16 hours. If it does, then blooming will be delayed and most likely cancelled. So at the end of summer, put your plant somewhere in total darkness for 16 hours every day. If you have a cupboard that doesn't get opened, then put it in there. You do need to be mindful of any cracks in the door that might let any light in. Otherwise the plant will think it's summer, and that includes any artificial light. To complicate things more, you also need to maintain a minimum temperature of 15 degrees Celsius or 60 degrees Fahrenheit during this period. Any lower than this and the plant will not bloom. So unfortunately, you can't chuck your plant into a dark, cold basement, so it'll likely be too cold for it. So once you've found this mythical place in your home, you also need to cut down watering to a much reduced rate to avoid the roots getting soggy. And then at the end of autumn, you should move it to a sunny spot with at least 6 hours of bright light, and the flowers are supposed to come out in full swing during winter. The problem is though that this is an insanely ridiculous routine. It's just not achievable in the modern world, so there's no way we're going to be able to get it to rebloom. Next, I have to give a shout out to the ever popular Tradescantia zebrina. The growth habit of this plant means that it's very difficult to keep a happy and full zebrina in our home long term. There are some plants that just seem like they're not happy living indoors. It's much happier spreading itself over an open field, taking over everything in the process. In your home, you're much more likely to have bare stems with rotting leaves hanging from the pot unless you follow the tips and tricks that I share in this video. So if you have one, make sure you click on the link.